First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to the O'Fallon Historical Society's first Zoom program. And I'm Brian Keller. I'm the current president of the Historical Society. And just a few housekeeping items first. You're welcome to use your camera and microphone if you have them, but neither is required. However, there will be a Q&A afterwards. If you can use your microphone to ask questions, that'd be great. Or you can also use the chat button at the bottom of the screen to send us messages, and we'll be watching for that. Also, we're recording this presentation and hope to make it available for later viewing. And as you can see behind me, I'm at the History Museum. And right now, the museum is currently open to the public on Wednesdays and Saturdays from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. Though we'll be closed tomorrow because of roadwork on State Street, but that should just be one day. And you don't need an appointment to visit on the Wednesdays or Saturdays, but you can make an appointment to visit at other times. If we have volunteers available, just send us an email or give us a call. And the building is well ventilated and masks and social distancing are required inside, but we welcome you to come. Before we get to our program, I know our Community Outreach and Engagement Committee Chair, Andrea Foni, would like to say a few words. So Andrea, are you there?
I am across the museum as well, sitting by probably one of my favorite things here in the museum that definitely ties in tonight. We have the life mask of Abraham Lincoln, pre and then post Civil War. And you really get a sense of the strain that he was under with the change in his facial features. So hopefully the program tonight will inspire you to stop by and check this out as well. If you guys that aren't members have any feedback from us, we'd love to hear it. So maybe we can continue this in the future with other programs, or if you have ideas of programs you would like to see, just reach out to us, either Facebook or our email. And we'd like to maybe see where we can take this type format in the future. So stop by, give us a call, text, email, however you want to get a hold of us, we're here. So without further ado, let's learn more about Lincoln and Douglas.
Okay, it's back to me, and just a quick commercial. If you're interested in joining the Historical Society, our dues are very cheap. If individual members is $15, family $20, and you get a quarterly newsletter and the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping preserve the history of the O'Fallon area. So anyway, now to our program, Lincoln and Douglas, An Unlikely Friendship. And our presenter, Gene Koski, is an Historical Society member and has lived in O'Fallon since 1994. He moved his family here from West St. Louis County to raise them in this small town, O'Fallon, with great traditions and community. He invested 23 years of his life serving O'Fallon on 4 boards and commissions and served for 2 terms, 8 years, on the O'Fallon City Council. He loves history, Lincoln, and O'Fallon. Gene has studied Lincoln for 50 years and was personally involved in the early design meetings of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois. Library and Museum, I'm sorry. He has spoken to many civic and history groups on Lincoln. So without further ado, Gene, it's all yours. There we go.
All righty. All right, I think we're ready to go. Well, first, let me just thank Brian and the Historical Society's board for allowing us to and agreeing to have our first online meeting. Obviously, none of us knew that COVID was going to go as long as it has. And so this is an opportunity to kind of introduce people to history. Tonight, we're going to obviously talk about Lincoln, which is very much tied to Illinois history. I want to thank everybody that is online tonight. Appreciate you being here. I'll add my commercial for the museum. The staff's been working really hard to reorganize things. The museum looks great. And so I would encourage you to come and see it. Okay, I presented many times on Lincoln and Douglas, but it's my first time doing it online. And so we're all in this together. It's kind of a virtual world right now where we're trusting technology, and you saw us fumble a little bit at the beginning. One unintended consequence of preparing for tonight is that I developed much more empathy for our teachers who are trying to teach classrooms full of kids at home now and do virtual teaching. And what I would say is encourage teachers, thank them for doing the best they can. And like I say, I've got more empathy. If you have any questions during the presentation tonight, just write them down, and then at the end we'll have the Q&A, and I'll try to answer any questions you might have. We're going to take about a 30-minute journey together, learn about two remarkable historical figures in American history. I'm going to talk briefly about their personal lives, how they grew up really in vastly different circumstances, different parts of the country, and how they really rose from almost impossible obscurity to become great leaders. And here we're talking about them 200 years later. So that's pretty remarkable. We're also going to talk about how unique they both were in their own way and how they became great leaders. We're going to learn a little bit about how their lives intersected during Lincoln's presidency. And then we're going to learn how they developed this unusual and rare interracial friendship that helped change America for the better. So tonight, I'll have been a success if I can do three things. The first one is I want to tell you something about American history that maybe you didn't know. Second, I hope to infect you with the Lincoln virus. I caught it in about 1967. I called it the Lincoln virus before we ever had a pandemic. And I can tell you I've had it for a long time, and it's incurable once you get the Lincoln virus. Lastly, I want to inspire you with this story, and I hope that you'll share it with other people. I've shared it with people up at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and they hadn't even heard the story. And so I think it's unique. I think it's something important. And I hope when you think about it, you can realize you can enrich your own life and develop a new and unlikely friendship. And so that would be a great outcome if that happened. So let's go on to this. So a lot of times when I'm giving this talk, I'll have that first slide up with Lincoln, and I'll put Lincoln and Douglas up, and everybody will think I'm going to talk about Stephen Douglas. And so obviously in the state of Illinois, that's a big topic. And so I'll show this slide to make it real clear to them that we're not going to talk about Stephen Douglas. We're going to talk about Frederick Douglass. But I do want to give a shout out to Stephen Douglas because he did accomplish two great things. The first thing is he unsuccessfully courted Mary in Springfield at the same time with Abraham. They were both dating the same girl. She chose Lincoln, married Lincoln, who happened to be a Whig at the time, and she helped make him president. So that's one thing Stephen accomplished, maybe in a backdoor way. The second was he defeated Abraham Lincoln in 1858 for the Senate race. And we all know about the famous debates that were published in the Eastern papers. And really, if Lincoln had won that Senate seat, he probably would never have been president. So it was great that Stephen Douglas went up to Washington with a job, and Lincoln could travel and talk about his positions and things and network his way into the presidency. This is kind of a fun picture. This is a little bit of my own Lincoln story. This is two of my four brothers. I'm the guy in the jean jacket on the left, lifting up my little brother with my other brother, Keith. Some people in Springfield had the idea that we were polishing Abraham Lincoln's nose by rubbing it. So they put it on a tall pedestal, and you see we were not deterred. I think Lincoln would get a laugh out of this because he probably would have been boosting his kids up there. They have since returned it in 2020 down to a lower pedestal, and you can see people can rub his nose again. Quickly about my Lincoln story, let me just tell you a couple things real quick. I was born in Arkansas. My dad was a U.S. Postal Inspector. He was transferred to northern Wisconsin. I lived about a half a block from Lake Superior, so I was way far north for a Southerner. Then we moved to Central Illinois in 1966. We took a family trip to Springfield, and that's where I caught the Lincoln virus. And so that's my brief story. All right, move on to one of my favorite historical writers, and just talk a little bit about history, because it's incomplete if we don't apply historical context. And so David McCullough always tells his group when he's speaking to, he says, you know, no one ever lived in the past. They lived in their present, and their present was very different from our present. Now that sounds obvious, but people sometimes don't get it because they look at history through the filter of how they live now, what our culture is now. So I show people this because I want to really talk about the fact that our culture is very different than the culture was during Lincoln and Douglas's time. Our communication modes are different. Our transportation modes are different. You know, today you can get in a car in Springfield and you can be in Vandalia in 1 hour and 23 minutes. During Lincoln's time, when he served in the Illinois legislature, it took 35 hours for him to travel from Springfield to Vandalia. And so you can see that time had a very different effect and importance in people's lives at that time. Also, entertainment was very different. In the 18th and 19th century, oratory and public speaking and rhetoric classes were a major form of education and entertainment. Great speakers were celebrities. People who came to hear Lincoln and Douglas stood for 2 and 3 hours to hear these two people talk. You can't imagine people doing that now. And so we need to study and consider context when we're studying history. This is a quote by Harold Hauser, and he's a Lincoln historian and a writer and worked for the Met up in New York. And he kind of summed up what he's come to believe about Lincoln and why he was memorable. And he says, you know, Lincoln was undeniably memorable, almost from the start of his life, a unique result of his environment, natural gifts, and self-discipline, somehow bigger than his social community and his time. He was aware of how high he would aspire, his extraordinary appearance, passionate love for books, physical strength, honesty, skill, and debate, tireless quest for political advancement, his rollicking sense of humor, concealing a deep and sometimes debilitating melancholy, all made onlookers take early and sustained interest. The man was different. I think that's what has always intrigued me about Lincoln, is how different he was from other people. He had a law partner, William Herndon, who was his law partner for 17 years in Springfield. And two of Herndon's quotes about Lincoln are pretty interesting and insightful. One was, Lincoln was the most ambitious man I ever knew. Now, we probably don't think about Lincoln being that ambitious, but he was. Another comment he made was, one phase of Lincoln's character was his righteous indignation when he was aroused. In such cases, he was the most fearless man I ever knew. Again, insight into Lincoln. And that's what we, you know, people who want to study about Lincoln are looking for. So Lincoln was complex. 16,000 books have been written about Lincoln. And and more are published every year. That's more books that have been written about any historical figure in all of our history of the world, except for Jesus Christ. So you can imagine, this is the second most wrote about, and talked about person in the world. Okay, I guess I want to take a little bit of time and talk about young Lincoln and young Frederick Douglass to kind of set the tone for when their lives intersect. So what about young Lincoln? Well, first, the Lincoln family and Abraham Lincoln had been in America a long time. He was a 7th generation of the Lincoln family in America. Now, he didn't have Ancestry.com. He didn't know all of his history. And, you know, I think he'd be surprised if he would have had the chance to find out. But his grandfather, who he's named after, Captain Abraham Lincoln, served in the Revolutionary War, and he was a pioneer settler in Kentucky and owned 5,500 acres. So very successful pioneer, very influential person. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. His father, Thomas, and his mother, Nancy, and his sister, Sarah, lived on 2 farms in Kentucky, both that were purchased and deeded to Thomas Lincoln. and both that he lost in court battles due to bad surveys and bad titles and deed practices in Kentucky. So Thomas decided he would move to the new state of Indiana, where everything had been surveyed. He could get land cheap. And so he purchased land in the Indiana wilderness, where his small pioneer family of 4 built a cabin, cleared a dense forest, and developed a sustainable farm. At 9, Lincoln's mother, Nancy, died of what's called the milk sick, and as did a number of people that they were related to that had come to Indiana with them, and other people in the community. So it was a blooming of a flower. The cows ate the flower, people drank the milk, and people died, and they didn't know what they were dying from. And so it took a generation for people to realize what it was. Thomas kind of struggled trying to take care of the farm and his 2 kids for a year of grief, and then he went back to Kentucky, went to a widow that he had met, Sarah Johnson, asked her if she wanted to marry him and come back to Indiana. She had 3 kids, so they moved back to Indiana, and they also had one of Nancy Hanks, his original mother, his real mother, birth mother, cousin, Dennis Hanks, living with them. So imagine this tiny cabin in the wilderness of Indiana. There were 2 widows and 6 orphans in a truly hard luck pioneer blended family, all living in one room with a loft. So, but the Lincoln family and the Johnson family blended together. They survived, they thrived, and they became really respected members of that community. And then we all know that one of those children grew strong in his body and his intellect, his character, his values, and would one day become president of the United States. So that's the great story that we love about Lincoln. When asked about his early life, Lincoln said this: "I was born in Kentucky, but I grew up in Indiana." He lived in Indiana from 7 until he was 21. And then he moved his family to a new farm in eastern Illinois. And then he set out on his own for a small river town called New Salem. And he lived in New Salem from 21 to 28 years old. And then he lived in Springfield from 28 to 52 years old when he was elected president. So I want to talk a little bit about the other person that we're talking about tonight, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and he was a slave and born in Talbot County, Maryland. He was raised in his master's home in Baltimore, where he was taught to read by someone in the family, likely his owner's wife. He was a house slave until he grew up into his teenage years. And when he reached that maturity, he was moved to the plantation in rural Maryland and placed under a person who's really identified as a harsh and notorious slave breaker for a full year. Because one of the things you had to do was take that person and really break the will to run from them. In 1838, he escaped slavery. He changed his name to Frederick Douglass, and he reinvented his life. He forged papers. He married a free person of color, Anna Murray, and he found work in the Baltimore shipyards. And so he was kind of living still in Maryland, you know, which is still a kind of a dangerous place because it's a slave state, but with free papers. So he was always looking over his shoulder, always worried about someone coming. In 1839, he heard a speech by a couple of famous abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, about the need to abolish slavery in America. And he was eventually hired by Garrison as a traveling speaker for the Anti-Slavery Society. In 1845, he published his first book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Really the first book to talk about what it was like to be a slave person here in the United States. And it was a triggering kind of moment because he soon learned that by publishing the book, he put a price on his head. And slave hunters, bounty hunters, were looking to return him back to slavery. And so he left America and went to England and Scotland and Europe. So let's keep going here. Let me go back a second. In 1846, some English admirers actually purchased Douglas's freedom, raised the money, so that when he came back to the United States, when he moved to Rochester, New York, he was able to buy and pay off the debt as a slave and become a free person for real. We talked a little bit about oratory being the kind of the art form. Well, Frederick Douglass, as he developed his ability to speak and he would tell his experiences, he became really a great orator, even much greater than Lincoln was. And it was a huge form of entertainment. When he was in Europe, hundreds of people would come to hear him speak, even thousands. He spoke in Paris at the Sorbonne. And he was quite honestly a rock star of the time, if you want to use that kind of analogy. He was 6'1". He was over 200 pounds. He had a strong, booming voice. He was handsome, and he really was adored by his audiences. And he used his celebrity as an author and a speaker and editor of a newspaper in Rochester called the North Star, an abolitionist newspaper, you can imagine. And he became really the single greatest influence in the abolition movement in America. So it's kind of interesting that in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States, he's probably not the most famous American. Frederick Douglass is probably the most famous American in the North and in Europe. In 1839, Frederick attends the first Women's Rights Conference convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and he becomes a double threat. He's an eloquent spokesman for emancipation, and he's also an eloquent spokesman for the rights of women in America. During that time, he also meets John Brown, another committed abolitionist. In 1853, he visits Harriet Beecher Stowe. And then he published his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. And he helps runaway slaves get to freedom, get to Canada through the Underground Railroad in Rochester, New York. So he's a busy man. All right, so in 1860, Lincoln gets elected. The Republican convention is conveniently held in Chicago, which didn't hurt his chances. He got 40% of the popular vote and won because there were two Democrats running against each other. And so it turned out that he got the most popular votes. He was inaugurated March 4th, which is much later than we inaugurate presidents. So he was elected in November and inaugurated in March. And by that time, 7 states had already seceded the Union. And so his first speech, the first inaugural address, Lincoln really spends time trying to stop war and secession of states. And he talks about intent, he's trying to be conciliatory to the southern states. And he talks about he's going to enforce the laws that are on the books, including the fugitive slave law, which provides that slave hunters have a right to hunt slaves in the North and return them to the South. And Frederick Douglass, when he heard that, was so disappointed with Abraham Lincoln, actually, maybe a better word would be disgusted, that he considered leaving the United States and moving to Haiti. And some friends talked him out of it and said, look, you could do that, but maybe a better option is to stay and fight for the rights of people of color here. And so that's what he ended up doing. Frederick continues to press Lincoln, and so he continues to press Lincoln, and he has a newspaper, he has a platform, and so people listen to him, and so for really 2 years, he really badgers Abraham Lincoln. He's not fond of him. He says Lincoln doesn't accept or recognize that the war is about the abolition of slavery. Lincoln at the first part of the war obviously is trying to keep states from leaving and things like that. Frederick Douglass also wants champions the recruitment of black soldiers, you know, at the start, something that Lincoln wasn't willing to do. He was demanding, once we did have black soldiers, he demanded that they be paid the same as white soldiers. He fought any attempts to resolve any of the race issues in America through colonization or any other solution that came up. And he basically took the position that he would accept nothing short of universal freedom and acceptance as equals. That was his platform. That was what was going to be his lodestone. And he had a newspaper and he had a speaking platform, and he delivered those criticisms to affluent people and broad coverage, both in the North and in Europe. And so you can imagine how the president felt about this guy who was constantly attacking. And so they had an adversarial relationship. And it really should have been the end of the story. There should be no possibility for any kind of partnership or opportunity or relationship or friendship between Lincoln and Douglass. But fortunately for the world and for America, that relationship didn't get stuck there. Sometimes people walk away and they draw a line and they don't ever go back. This story is bigger and better than that story. In fact, I think it's one of the best stories that I know about, where people who rise above their personal feelings, they're learning in a crisis, they set aside personal enmity and history, stand strong together on moral principles, really to create a greater good. And so that's part of what makes this such a remarkable story. And here's the real hope, that when people do that, they could create this more perfect union in country that was aligned with the promise and the purpose that was written in the Declaration of Independence 80 years before this, that all men were created equal. And that was a powerful concept that they both really had in the forefront. So slowly, Lincoln, starts to gain a little bit of momentum, get his arms around and footing around the administration. He had never run really anything bigger than a law office, and he generally had his junior partner, William Herndon, do that. And so Lincoln didn't have a lot of administrative skills, and he had to kind of learn on the job. But what he did have was this strong personal character and leadership qualities and intellect. So that's what he relied on. And don't forget, he's a war president. So in 1860, we had this little tiny US Army posted mainly in the West. And we had all these states succeeding and we're heading towards civil war. And Lincoln really had to do a lot of work to get the Army going, get the government up and running, and enormous really burdens of managing a government in crisis all around it. And he engaged those resources in the North, to supply the Army. He even, was checking books out of the Smithsonian to learn tactics. He developed some of the military strategy, and then he tried to find competent generals. Political generals were not very competent and field trained, so he needed to find great generals. He went through 7 generals before he got to Grant. So it was a constant process. And of course, the Confederacy got some great leaders, all West Point graduates, and all who had been posted in the West. And so it was one of those experiences that he had to go through. But while he was going through it, Frederick Douglass started watching him, and he became intrigued with President Lincoln. He saw that Lincoln was really growing and adapting and learning and changing. And he began to see Lincoln as a man of tremendous principle, someone who showed, signs of being open to a bigger purpose and a meaning for the Civil War. And that realization and recognition that Lincoln was getting his arms around things really created kind of a personal transformation in Frederick Douglass. And he went from being this harsh critic for the first 2 years and a skeptic and someone who thought we'd elected the wrong person. And he became more of an intrigued watcher, kind of a political file. He made sure he listened to what Lincoln was saying. And he engaged, he really became an engaged ally, which then converted himself into a friend and a lifelong admirer of Abraham Lincoln. And that's a remarkable transformation in any kind of relationship. And it took time, it took observation, it took patience, it took really a common objective. And most importantly, it took trust and forgiveness, right? People had said some pretty mean things and you have to be able to forgive. One thing Lincoln could do was put the issue ahead of that. So that's a little bit about Lincoln. So we're going to talk, we're going to have to, just for time's sake, we're going to have to speed forward up to January 1st, 1863, when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And we're going to talk about really 3 historical meetings around that after that Lincoln and he had. But the Emancipation Proclamation was something that I think Lincoln evolved on. He saw he might have the opportunity as the war kind of changed. And I think here's kind of an interesting fact, and that is that when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, his hometown citizens in Springfield protested at the fairgrounds. 40,000 people showed up to be against the Emancipation Proclamation in his hometown. So kind of a fun fact. Not only did he have people in Washington not thinking it was a great idea and across the country, but even in his hometown, they didn't think it was a great idea. So, all right, so we're going to talk about these 3 meetings. One thing I would say real quick is I'll use the term executive mansion because the White House hadn't been named the White House in Lincoln's time. So the meetings took place in the White House, what we call the White House now, but really the executive mansion. And these meetings are really critical in the timeline of what was going on in America. And this is really the first time that in the history of this nation, which was 80 years old at that point, when the President of the United States requested a person of color come to the White House for the purpose of seeking advice and counsel. And that's pretty remarkable. You know, Black people and Native Americans had visited the White House, but not for the purpose of advising the president, but just for the purpose of meeting the president. But this was the first time in our history that it was done to advise and counsel. Now, when I'm in a big group, I generally ask, when do you think the second time was? Well, I can't do that really here, so I'm going to give that away. The next time that this takes place in our country history is 100 years later, when President Johnson invites Martin Luther King to come to the White House and provide him advice and counsel. Now, that's an uncomfortable insight into America, that the first 80 years, no one was included, and then 100 years passed until someone was asked and included. And so that's why, you know, some of the issues that percolate in our society continue to do that. I'm not going to go into a lot of that, but it's why our commitment to the diversity and inclusion needs to always be part of our challenge. All right. In August of 1863, Frederick Douglass met with the president in the private office. And in his autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, he wrote about that meeting. And I want to use his words to describe the meetings, because Lincoln never wrote anything about the meetings, right? And so, and I don't know that Lincoln would have ever wrote a biography of himself after he left office, which is now a tradition. And his secretaries didn't write about the meetings, but Frederick Douglass wrote about it. So I'm going to read Frederick Douglass's words about that first meeting. The increasing opposition to the war in the North and the mad cry against it because it was being made an abolition war alarmed Mr. Lincoln and made him apprehensive that a peace might be forced upon him, which would leave still in slavery all those who come within our lines. So what he wanted was to make his proclamation as effective as possible in the event of a peace. And he said in a regretful tone, the slaves are not coming so rapidly and so numerously to us as I had hoped. And I replied, well, the slave owners know how to keep such things from their slaves, and probably very few even know there was a proclamation. Well, he said, I want you to set about devising some means of making them acquainted with it and bringing them into our lines. And he spoke with great earnestness and solicitude, and he seemed troubled by the attitude of Mr. Greeley and the growing impatience there was being manifested in the North at the war. And he saw the danger of premature peace, and like a thoughtful and sagacious man he was, he wished to provide means of rendering such consummation as harmless as possible. What he said to me on that day showed a deeper moral conviction against slavery than I had ever seen before in anything spoken or written by him. So I listened with deep interest and profoundest satisfaction, and at his suggestion, I agreed to undertake the organizing of a band of scouts composed of colored men whose business should be somewhat after the original plan of John Brown, to go into the rebel states beyond the enemy lines of our armies and carry the news of emancipation and urge the slaves to come within our boundaries. Now think about these two people, their adversarial public feud of these two leaders. And now they're meeting, and the president asked Frederick Douglass, a former slave, to engage in planning military covert actions behind enemy lines, an action that could very well cost him and those he recruited their freedom and their lives. And here's a remarkable thing, is Lincoln was asking Douglass to put his words and his principles into action for a cause that he believed in and championed. And that's pretty remarkable. And here's the amazing thing. He agreed to do it. And he began to work towards that end. Let's talk about another meeting that they had. And that meeting was a year later on August 19th in 1864. Douglass returned to the executive mansion at the president's request. And he wrote that he was impressed that the president had prolonged their conversation despite the arrival of the Connecticut governor. And Douglass recalled that event in his biography. And again, I'm going to read Douglass's words. And he said, Mr. Lincoln said to his secretary, tell Governor Buckingham to wait, for I want to have a long talk with my friend Frederick Douglass. And Douglass commented, this was probably the first time in the history of this republic when its chief magistrate found occasion or disposition to exercise such an act of impartiality between persons so widely different in their positions and their supposed claims on his attention. So what we would probably consider just a simple gesture of normal courtesy today, in context then, would have been a political and socially disrespectful action by the president to be talking to someone of color when the governor arrived. And that was the reality for persons of color in our country, even free and successful persons of color. And so it gives us, again, some more insight into Lincoln. Now, on January 20th, 1865, Frederick Douglass attended the second inauguration, which was basically the 23rd inauguration of the President of the United States. And he wrote about that experience. So I'm going to read you his experience at being at the second inauguration of President Lincoln. Reaching the Capitol, I took my place in the crowd, where I could see the presidential procession as it came upon the east portico, and where I could hear and all could see what took place. The whole proceeding was wonderfully quiet and earnest and solemn, from the oath administered by Chief Justice Chase to the brief but weighty address delivered by Mr. Lincoln. There was a leaden stillness about the crowd. The address sounded more like a sermon than a state paper. I would, I guess, strongly encourage you to look up and read Lincoln's second inaugural address. It'll take you all of 7 minutes to read it. It is the second shortest inaugural address in American history, second to George Washington's, which basically said, "Thanks for reelecting me." And so, and it's short with 701 words, but it's powerful. He mentions God 14 times. He quotes the Bible 4 times, and he invokes prayer 3 times. And the audience was really expecting a victory speech, a pummeling of the South, you know, for starting this war and for the travesty of 640,000 casualties. They wanted a speech of retribution, and that's what they were expecting. And instead, they got this sermon on forgiveness. So I know many of you know this piece of the second inaugural address, but basically Lincoln's trying to say, you know, we need to forgive each other with malice towards none, charity for all, firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, to strive on to finish the work we're in, bind up the nation's wounds, care for him who has borne the battle and his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just, lasting peace among ourselves and all nations. You know, one of the greatest speeches in the moment ever delivered. And it was interesting because the crowd didn't know how to take it. There was no applause. There was, you know, when he got done, they couldn't believe the speech was over. Some were even still arriving. So Frederick Douglass decides, he was obviously at the speech. Frederick Douglass decides that he's going to challenge convention. And so he goes on to describe events later that evening when he decided to go to the inaugural ball at the White House, Executive Mansion. And he wrote about it. So again, I'm going to read Frederick Douglass's words about that experience. For the first time in my life, and I suppose the first time in any colored man's life, I attended the reception of President Lincoln on the evening of the inauguration. And as I approached the door, I was seized by 2 policemen and forbidden to enter. I said to them that they were mistaken entirely in what they were doing, that if Mr. Lincoln knew that I was at the door, he would order my admission. And I bolted in by them. On the inside, I was taken charge by 2 other policemen to be conducted, I suppose, to the president. But instead, they were conducting me out a window on a plank. "Oh," I said, "this will not do, gentlemen." And as a gentleman who was a member of Congress was passing by, I said to him, "Just say to Mr. Lincoln, Fred Douglass is at the door." He rushed to the president, and almost in less than half a minute, I was invited into the East Room of the White House. A perfect sea of beauty and elegance, too, it was. The ladies were in very fine attire, and Mrs. Lincoln was standing there. And I could not have been more than 10 feet from him when Mr. Lincoln saw me. His countenance lighted up, and he said in a voice which could be heard all around, "Here comes my friend Douglass." As I approached him, he reached out his hand, grabbed me a cordial shake, gave me a cordial shake, and he said, "Douglass, I saw you in the crowd today listening to my inaugural address." And I want to go to this slide. "There is no man's opinion that I value more than yours. What do you think of it?" And I said, "Mr. Lincoln, I can't stop here and talk to you. There are thousands of people waiting to shake you by the hand." But he said again, "What did you think of it?" And he said, "Mr. Lincoln, it was a sacred effort." And then I walked off. "I'm glad you liked it," he said, "but that was the last time I saw him to speak to him." Now, this is probably one of the greatest teaching moments in the history of our country. If you think about it, all eyes in that room were on those two great leaders. You know, in a time when the average height of people in America was 5'7", you had someone 6'4" and someone 6'2" coming across the reception room, the East Room in the White House, you know, and I'm sure that I would have loved to have been in this moment, because I can just imagine what people were saying to each other that were standing in the reception. And think about the message that Lincoln and Douglas were attempting to convey to the room full of Washington politicians and the social elite. Here's two American leaders, one white, one black, in a nation that's divided by war, giving the people in that room a glimpse of what the future might be if they could only learn to view each other as equals. But sadly, as we know, events transpired to change that, plunge the nation into mourning. And instead of celebrating the end of the war, the nation is really mourning the loss of our president, Abraham Lincoln. So the war ended when Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9th, 1865. Lincoln gave his last speech from the little balcony above the front door of the White House on April 10th. And in that last speech, he talked about granting citizenship to people of color. He asked for the band to play Dixie at that meeting. And there were two people in the audience, John Wilkes Booth and one of the other conspirators. And they decided that night they were going to go into the action of assassination of the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of State. And Lincoln was assassinated, Seward was attacked and nearly killed. The person who was supposed to kill Andrew Johnson chickened out. So, but April 14th, the president was assassinated. He died on the 15th. And here's another interesting little bit of information. You know, the funeral was held in Washington. Mary Lincoln was too upset to even attend. And then they began this long journey taking the president's body back to Springfield from April 21st to May 4th. And here's a couple of really interesting facts. You know, it was a 1,600-mile journey, 180 cities, 7 states, and 25 million Americans attended memorial services or witnessed the train pass their communities. So a remarkable situation. Following Lincoln's death, 6 weeks later, Frederick Douglass kind of allied himself with the Republicans at that time. And he also, I think something very interesting is he became friends with Mary Lincoln. He had a lot of empathy for her, and he would write about Mary Lincoln. And so I wanted to talk about that because, you know, she's not treated very well in history. But this is what Frederick Douglass said about Mary Lincoln. It's often said during the war that Mrs. Lincoln did not sympathize fully with her husband in his anti-slavery feeling. But I never believed that concerning her, and have good reason for being confirmed in my impression by her by that fact. When Mr. Lincoln died and she was about leaving the White House, she selected his favorite walking cane and said, "I know of no one that would appreciate this more than Fred Douglass." And she sent it to me in Rochester, and I have it in my house to this day, and I expect to keep it there for as long as I live. And here's a picture of that cane, and it is in fact still in Frederick Douglass's house, and it is Lincoln's favorite walking cane. So talk a little bit about the rest of the story. President Grant appointed Frederick Douglass the Marshal of the District of Columbia, and then the Minister to Haiti. which were the two highest appointed positions in the federal government to which a Black American was appointed in the entire 19th century. So, what does Lincoln and Douglas and this unlikely friendship mean for us today? Well, I have a couple of suggestions. I hope you'll think about it and come up with some of your own. But first, I really like Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, I think we can purposely choose to set aside past differences with each other and really focus on common interests for the good of the community and for America. Our nation needs that healing now. We need some forgiveness now. Second, I think we can learn to really embrace this tension and friction that goes on in every relationship, business action, political situation, and make that tension and friction purposeful and meaningful. And then lastly, I think we can learn to extend our hand to others, to those who are different from us, and maybe how they look or how they speak or what they believe. And we can become really a more bold and inclusive and open people. You know, I hope you'll believe that Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass were united in this belief that America could be better with all of us. So that's my presentation. I want to thank you for this privilege, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Gene, we have one chat out there. I don't know if you saw it or not, but it's, the question is, how did Douglas get to England, Ireland, etc.? Did he have money or work his way over? Or
well, I'll tell you, he had a lot of benefactors. You know, the abolition movement were looking for people that would be willing to, you know, really talk about abolition, tell their story. Obviously, Frederick Douglass was a master at that. And there were people who helped fund him. He also, you know, now this was after he wrote the book, before he founded the newspaper, but he also had, you know, later he had money from his own North Star newspaper and things like that. But you know, people were very interested in changing America. They were very interested in you know, the emancipation and then citizenship, and so they were willing to help him.
thank you, Gene. Does anybody else have any questions? You should be able to unmute yourself, so go ahead and try if you have one. Or you can send us a chat.
I have a comment for you, Gene. First of all, it was an excellent presentation. It was 100 years later, after Douglass, that we finally had a change in America. And of course, in that interval, we had Reconstruction, and then we had the deconstruction, or whatever term is appropriate. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that.
Well, you know, yeah, I'd be glad to. And I'll try and keep it brief. You know, after Grant was elected president, there was a lot of people of color elected to office as senators and representatives from the South, because as you realize, the South had the slaves, 3.5 million freed, and they actually you know, the population was larger than the population of the plantation and the white people in the South. And so there were a significant number of people who went to Congress from the South who were people of color, and they were making progress. And, you know, that alarmed, obviously, Southerners, and Jim Crow came in, and we went backwards again. But I think under Grant, and you know, there's a big revision of Grant in history. He was a pretty amazing president. You know, he got a bad rap for a long time. You know, I think probably 3 people in American history got the worst rap as Thomas Lincoln, Lincoln's father, Mary Lincoln, his wife, and Grant, you know, because he was a drunk. And, you know, and so, you know, that, and historians kept telling that story. But I think what is really sad is that we made progress, you know, we did the right things, and then it regressed. And it regressed for a long time. And a lot of our tensions that we have now and strife we have now are really an outcome of that, not including people for such a long time.
I want to see if this thing works. I guess I'm on. First of all, Gene, thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. And I think for the Historical Society, there weren't any technical problems, and this is a way we could do other meetings, and as long as we're under these conditions. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, I guess I answered everybody's questions.
Not to belabor this too much, but tell us again, when was it that Douglas went over to England, Ireland, and all of that, and what were the reasons for his going?
Well, he had published his book, and at that point, he had never purchased his freedom back from his original slave owners. And so he basically got on, he went to Canada, and then he took a ship over to England and Scotland and Europe, basically to keep from being apprehended under the fugitive slave law. And
it was at that time, he's had enough friends to be able to finance this. Is that right?
Well, while he was there, he had some benefactors both in England and Scotland who gave him enough money to come back and purchase his freedom.
No, but I mean, how did he get there in the first place? That's what I'm after.
Well, I'm sure again he had benefactors helping him at that time too. So
very good.
You know, and the you know he was also being paid, you know, to give speeches and do you know, and paid for his books and things like that. So he had his own money as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Gene, it's Jessica Lutz. Thank you for presenting tonight. I have a question. Is there much written documentation about how President Lincoln may have responded to criticism regarding this friendship, or inviting someone who historically may not have been welcome to? I would just really like to read something about the courage and how he laid out sort of why this was the right thing to do when at the time most people believed maybe it wasn't.
Well, you know, that's an interesting question because, you know, there are some great biographies out there. Ron White wrote one, A. Lincoln. You know, Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote one, Team of Rivals, and there's some information in that. I think the best book on Lincoln and Douglas, though, is really the book called Giants by the history chair at Harvard. And it's really a great story, more in depth than I had in 30 minutes or 35 minutes, which really kind of talks about how these two people got each other. You know, they were both raised to where they understood the power of words. And, you know, Frederick Douglass was a slave. Abraham Lincoln, I think, you know, turned all his wages over to his dad till he was 21, you know, and went out on his own. And I think in some ways, you know, he felt like his dad may have taken advantage of him. And he was, not to say he was a slave, because I don't believe that relationship is equal. But these two people had parallel lives. And when they came together and got past the attacks and adversity, they really liked each other. And I think, you know, obviously Lincoln was looking for a strategy to win, and he was willing to forgive some of the things that Douglas did and ask him to help him. And Douglas kind of got over himself a little bit. Although, you know, I will say this about Frederick Douglass, when he made up his mind to do something, he certainly did it, and he stuck to his principles too. And I would love to have seen, you know, listened to a tape of a discussion between Lincoln and Douglass in the executive office. Obviously, Frederick Douglass didn't write about everything, but I bet they went at it. They were both great debaters. And so, but I think, you know, it's sad that there weren't that many interracial friendships. It just wasn't a Victorian thing, you know, and it was just part of the culture that Lincoln didn't really care about that stuff, you know, and like he said to his secretary, you know, tell the governor to wait. I'm talking with my friend Douglas. So I don't think that kind of stuff bothered him. So, one of the great
Thanks, Gene.
things about Lincoln. So. All right, that might have been it, huh, Brian?
I think so. Yeah.
Well, here's one thing I'll offer is that you know, when we get past this pandemic and people are more free to move around, maybe we can have a session down at the museum where anybody can come in and ask a question. I've got some interesting historical documents I'd be willing to share when we can all get together and we can all just have a discussion about it.
Sounds great. Well, thank you again for presenting a really wonderful program tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. We were glad to have you. And we hope in the future to have more programs like this, especially since we really don't know how long we're going to be able to have in-person programs. So hopefully it went well for everyone from a technical standpoint as well. And anyway, unless there's any other questions, I'll just say good night and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting.